Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet? If you're enjoying our stories about real-life gangsters, take just a second to subscribe. It's free, and it really helps us keep bringing you more true gangster tales every day. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story from the world of the mob. Brooklyn, 1920s, a place that smelled like roasted coffee, cigar smoke, and the sweat of dreams trying to survive. It was a time when men built empires out of whispers and handshakes, and loyalty was worth more than gold. In the middle of that restless storm stood a quiet man who seemed ordinary, almost invisible, yet those who really knew him said he was the kind of man you should never underestimate. His name was Joe Profaci. He didn't look like the kind of man who'd one day become one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. He didn't have the sharp suits or the flashy cars that others wore like armor. Instead, he dressed humbly, spoke softly, and smiled often, a mask of gentleness that hid a mind sharper than a blade. He wasn't a killer by instinct, but he understood power in ways that few others did. Joe came from Calabria, Italy, and like so many immigrants, he arrived in America chasing something he couldn't quite name. Brooklyn was alive with the hum of opportunity, factories, markets, ships coming and going, and Joe worked every job he could find. He wasn't the strongest, but he was clever. He paid attention. He listened. And while other men boasted, he learned. His first success came not from crime, but from olive oil. In an era where Italian families prized it like treasure, Joe saw the business potential. He started small, importing a few barrels from Sicily, bottling it himself, selling it door to door. But it didn't take long before his Mamma Mia olive oil became a staple in Italian households across New York. He built it with care and patience, building relationships with grocers, church leaders, and neighborhood bosses. What most people didn't see, though, was how Joe used that business as something more, a bridge between the legitimate world and the one that existed in shadows. His warehouses, his deliveries, his shipments, they all served another purpose when needed. He understood the beauty of duality, to be respectable in the light, yet formidable in the dark. By the late 1920s, Prohibition had turned ordinary men into legends overnight. Whiskey and rum flowed through the veins of the city, and Joe, though cautious, couldn't resist the tide. He wasn't like the hotheads who went all in. No, he moved carefully, building alliances with those who mattered. He had a particular talent for diplomacy, the ability to make men trust him, even when they knew better. It was through this calm, calculating nature that Joe found himself rubbing shoulders with names like Joe Masseria, Salvatore Maranzano, and later, a young man named Lucky Luciano. These were men who carved the new American mafia from the chaos of old world traditions, and Joe played his role perfectly, the peacemaker, the mediator, the quiet conciliere type who always seemed to find the middle ground. But make no mistake, under that calm surface was steel. Those who mistook his soft voice for weakness learned quickly how wrong they were. Joe never raised his hand unless he had to, but when he did, the message was final. He didn't rule through fear like some, but through respect, and the kind of quiet power that made others think twice before crossing him. By 1931, when the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between rival Italian factions, ended, Joe Profaci emerged not as a corpse or casualty, but as one of the last men standing. While others fought in the streets, he negotiated, stayed in the background, and waited. When the dust cleared, Lucky Luciano reorganized the mafia into what became known as the Commission, a board of powerful bosses meant to keep order. Joe Profaci earned his place at that table. He became the head of one of New York's 5 families, a dynasty that bore his name. Yet even as he rose, he stayed the same man, the olive oil king, the church donor, the humble family man who went to mass every Sunday. His neighbors called him Don Pepino, and they adored him. To them, he was generous, charming, a pillar of the community. But inside his circle there was a saying, The man who prays the loudest is often the one hiding the biggest sins. Joe's empire ran on loyalty, discipline, and money. He demanded tribute from everyone who earned under his protection, and in return, he kept the peace. Those who paid lived well. Those who didn't, well, they disappeared quietly, like smoke fading from a candle. Still, for years, Joe managed to keep his name out of the newspapers. He let others attract the heat. Men like Luciano, Costello, and Genovese took the headlines while Joe kept building quietly, like a man stacking bricks in the dark. He believed in longevity. That true power wasn't about being feared for a day, but respected for decades. In his mind, the mafia was a kingdom, and he was its patient ruler. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman guided by honor and tradition. He attended every family wedding, every funeral, made donations to churches and charities. He even hosted grand summer picnics for his men and their families, food, music, laughter echoing through his Long Island estate. It was all part of his strategy. A happy soldier doesn't rebel, but in every kingdom peace is fragile. Beneath the laughter and wine, small cracks began to form. Younger men, hungrier men, started whispering. They saw Joe's old world ways as outdated. They wanted faster money, flashier power. Men like Joey Gallo, fiery, unpredictable, looked at Joe and saw a relic. And though Joe didn't know it yet, those whispers would soon turn into storms. For now, though, in the late 1940s, he sat on the porch of his Long Island home, watching the sun sink below the horizon, a cup of espresso in his hand. The world was changing. New faces, new ambitions, new dangers. But Joe Profaci wasn't afraid. He'd built an empire that had survived every upheaval, every war. And as he gazed into the fading light, a faint smile crossed his lips. "They think they understand power," he murmured to himself. "But power isn't about noise. It's about silence." That was the world Joe lived by. A world that rewarded patience, punished pride, and where one quiet man could rule for decades simply by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. The years rolled by, and Joe Profaci's empire blossomed like a well-tended vineyard. What began as an olive oil business had turned into a sprawling network of influence, restaurants, docks, unions, and warehouses that quietly fed his fortune. From Brooklyn to Long Island, from Harlem to Staten Island, there wasn't a single Italian grocery store or shipping route that didn't, in some quiet way, answer to him. He liked it that way, quiet. Joe had never been one for noise or headlines. His rivals, like Vito Genovese or Carlo Gambino, might have moved more ruthlessly, but none did it with Joe's patience. He had an almost religious devotion to order. To him, chaos was the enemy, and discipline was sacred. He expected it from everyone around him, especially his soldiers. Every Sunday, his men would gather for Mass at Our Lady of Loreto Church in Brooklyn. Joe would sit in the front pew, his head bowed, his rosary sliding through his fingers. When the service ended, he would greet the priest, make a generous donation, and then invite a few trusted men to lunch at his estate. There, under the shade of olive trees he'd planted himself, they would eat pasta, drink wine, and discuss business like it was family gossip. He was a man who blended faith and power seamlessly. In his mind, God had blessed him with success, and it was his duty to maintain order in the world he governed. He didn't call it the mafia, he called it the family. And to Joe, that word wasn't just a title, it was a promise. Still, beneath that calm exterior, tensions were growing. His soldiers began to whisper that Joe was too stingy. They saw how much money came in and how little trickled down. Joe was generous with the church, with politicians, with community events, but when it came to his men, he was tight-fisted. It wasn't that Joe didn't have money. He had more than he could ever spend. But he believed wealth was a privilege to be controlled, not shared. A man who spends too much, he once told his underboss, ends up being owned by what he buys. That philosophy didn't sit well with everyone, especially the younger generation. By the early 1950s, a new breed of gangsters was rising. Louder, more reckless, and hungry for recognition. They had grown up during the war, surrounded by chaos and greed. Men like Joe Gallo, a fiery and unpredictable soldier from Brooklyn, didn't see the point in patience. He looked at Joe Profaci's old-world manners and saw weakness. To him, the world had changed, and the old Don was just standing in the way. But Joe wasn't blind. He saw the change coming. He watched the younger men with quiet interest, their ambition, their restlessness. He knew that keeping control meant balancing fear and respect. Too much of either, and the structure collapsed. So he used what he always had, his calm and his faith. When a rival family tried to encroach on his territory near Red Hook, Joe didn't send soldiers with guns. He sent emissaries with wine and conversation. By the end of the week, the rival boss had agreed to partnership terms, which meant Joe now owned half of what they once controlled. It was diplomacy disguised as generosity, and it worked almost every time. He knew when to be kind and when to be cold. There was one story his men often whispered about, a young soldier who tried to skim money from the olive oil operation, thinking Joe would never notice. Joe invited the man to dinner, served him a feast, poured him wine, and told him he forgave him. The man left the house relieved, almost giddy. The next day, he was gone. No one knew who ordered it, and no one asked. That was Joe's way. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply smiled, and the world understood what that meant. But for all his control, the outside world was changing faster than even he could manage. The Kefauver hearings in the early 1950s began dragging the word mafia into the national spotlight. Senators, reporters, and television audiences wanted names. The myth of the invisible empire was becoming visible. Joe hated it. He believed silence was sacred. Every headline felt like a betrayal of the code he'd lived by. So he pulled back further from the public eye. He moved his meetings to quiet villas in Long Island, spoke less, trusted fewer people. His olive oil company continued to flourish, even appearing legitimate in every record. When investigators came sniffing around, he offered them coffee and paperwork so clean it gleamed. Still, inside his own ranks, unease grew. His brother-in-law, Magliocco, was loyal, but aging. Younger lieutenants started asking questions that sounded like challenges. And somewhere in Brooklyn, Joey Gallo began forming ideas that would soon turn the Profaci family inside out. For now, though, Joe remained unbothered. He walked through his gardens at night, rosary in hand, the moonlight falling over his shoulders. To him, rebellion was a natural part of power. It always came, always burned out. He'd seen dozens of ambitious men rise and fall like sparks from a fire. He believed this new generation would be no different. As he stood by the garden wall, listening to the faint hum of the city far away, he murmured softly in Italian, "La calma è potere." Calm is power. But in the distance, that calm was already cracking. The young wolves were circling, restless and hungry, and the man who had ruled Brooklyn with patience and prayer was about to face the greatest test of his reign, not from the law, but from within his own family. Brooklyn, 1958. The air was different now, tense, thick, electric. The city had changed, and so had the people running its shadows. The old quiet loyalty that Joe Profaci had built his empire on was fading, replaced by something raw and impatient. The young generation didn't want to wait their turn. They wanted a piece of the pie now, and they were willing to bite for it. Among them was a name that Joe could no longer ignore. Joey Gallo. Gallo was everything Joe wasn't. Loud, unpredictable, charming in a dangerous sort of way. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of enemies and leave with half of them wanting to buy him a drink. He didn't just play the game. He rewrote it, smiling all the while. And unlike the old Dons, Joey didn't believe in rules. For years, Gallo and his brothers, Larry and Albert, had served under the Profaci banner. They ran rackets, collected money, and did the dirty work that made the olive oil king rich. But now they were tired of waiting. They saw how Joe lived like royalty while they scraped for crumbs. "He treats us like his priests," Joey once told a friend. "We confess, we kneel, and he gives us nothing but blessings." That was the seed of rebellion. Joe, of course, had heard the whispers. Nothing happened in his family without his knowledge. His network of eyes and ears stretched across the city like vines. He knew the gallows were restless, but he believed he could contain them. He always had before. He invited Joey to his estate one afternoon, hoping to calm things down before they became a storm. Joey arrived wearing a bright suit and sunglasses, a grin on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Joe greeted him warmly, as if nothing were wrong. They sat under the shade of the olive trees, the same place where Joe had made countless deals in his lifetime. "I hear you've been busy," Joe began softly. "I'm a worker, Joe," Joey said, leaning back. "You taught me that. Hard work brings blessings, right?" Joe smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried weight. "Blessings come to those who respect where they come from. Don't forget who gave you your start, Joey." Joey nodded slowly. "I haven't forgotten. I just think maybe it's time the blessings got shared a little more evenly." That was it. The unspoken war had finally found its first words. Joe didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the younger man for a long moment, then said, "Ambition without respect is a fire that burns the hand that lights it." Joey left that day without shaking his hand. Weeks later, things began to unravel. Joe's businesses started seeing disruptions. Money missing from shipments, collections coming up short, trucks getting hijacked by unknown men. Everyone knew who was behind it, but no one dared say it out loud. Joey and his crew had gone rogue. They began calling themselves the Gallo Crew, and they weren't shy about it. They took over bars, hijacked loads meant for the Profaci operation, and even kidnapped a few of Joe's men to send a message. The old Don's time was ending. Joe Profaci, ever the strategist, didn't strike back immediately. He believed in patience even when surrounded by chaos. Instead, he tightened his inner circle, cut off the gallows from family business, and began working quietly behind the scenes to reclaim control. But the cracks were spreading fast. Some of Joe's own captains began questioning his leadership. "You can't reason with wolves, Joe," one of them said. "They smell blood. They won't stop until they eat." But Joe didn't respond with violence. Not yet. He still believed he could restore order without tearing his empire apart. To him, shedding family blood was the gravest sin. Meanwhile, Joey Gallo was becoming something of a folk hero in the underworld. He mingled with artists, writers, and jazz musicians. He dressed like a movie star, spoke like a poet, and carried himself like a revolutionary. To the younger guys, he was the future. To Joe Profaci, he was poison. The newspapers began picking up on the feud, dubbing it the Profaci-Gallo War. Joe hated the headlines. For a man who had spent decades building a reputation of calm invisibility, being dragged into the public eye felt like humiliation. And then came the first real act of war. One night, as Joe's convoy traveled home from a meeting in Long Island, a car appeared from nowhere. The windows rolled down and the air filled with sharp flashes of light. Joe's driver swerved, tires screeching. When the smoke cleared, Joe was alive, shaken, but alive. His driver wasn't so lucky. That night, Joe stood alone in his garden, staring at the stars. He didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't even pray. He just stood there, letting the weight of betrayal settle in his chest. He had tried peace. He had tried patience. But now, even a man of faith knew that sometimes peace needed to be protected with iron. The next morning, he called a meeting. "Enough," he said quietly. "If they want fire, we'll show them how it burns." His men nodded. The war had begun. What followed would be one of the bloodiest internal feuds in New York's underworld. One that would tear the Profaci family apart from the inside, pit brother against brother, and test every rule Joe had built his life upon. And as the streets grew darker, Joe Profaci would be forced to decide what mattered more, his code of faith or his grip on power. The summer of 1960 came heavy and mean. Heat clung to Brooklyn like a fever, and the city seemed to sweat tension from its bricks. On the streets, whispers had turned into open defiance. The Gallo crew wasn't hiding anymore. They were taking what they wanted, and they wanted everything. Joe Profaci's once peaceful empire was now a battlefield, and for the first time in decades, fear began to ripple through his ranks. The Gallo brothers had crossed the line from rebellion into open war. They kidnapped 4 of Profaci's top men, Joe Magliocco's cousin Frank, along with Joe Gioeli, John Simone, and a man everyone called Fat Tony. The hostages were held in basements and apartments around Brooklyn while the Gallos made their demands clear. They wanted a bigger cut of the operations and total independence from Joe's iron rule. The kidnapping was a message, a loud, brutal one. No one had ever done that to Joe before. It was personal. Joe's response was silence. To the outside world, it looked like weakness. But inside, he was plotting. For weeks, he didn't move a muscle. No retaliation, no counterstrike. He simply waited, let the Gallo crew grow comfortable, let them believe they had cornered the king. But Joe was a master of patience. He didn't strike out of anger. He struck when the moment guaranteed victory. Finally, one quiet Sunday, the hostages were released. The Gallos said it was a gesture of goodwill. But the message was clear. They thought they had humiliated the Don. That's when Joe decided the talking was over. Through intermediaries and favors owed, he reached out to a few trusted old-timers, men from the old Sicilian days who believed in silent retribution. Meetings were held in the backs of bakeries and quiet restaurants. Plans whispered over cups of espresso. The Gallo brothers began noticing something strange. Their allies were disappearing. Men who had backed them just a week before suddenly moved out of the city, changed numbers, or simply vanished. The phone stopped ringing. The bars that once welcomed them closed early. It was as if the city itself had turned cold. Joe Profaci was squeezing them without firing a shot. Supplies dried up, money routes closed, and businesses that had once been Gallo territory started slipping away one by one. The streets whispered that the Don had gone quiet, but his silence was the kind that came before a storm. One evening, Joey Gallo sat in a smoky bar, glass of bourbon in hand, his crew tense around him. "You feel that?" he said softly. "That's not peace. That's him breathing down our necks." He wasn't wrong. Joe Profaci had turned the tables without leaving his home. He sent out quiet orders, no flashy executions, no blood in the streets. Instead, debts were called in, deals were broken, and anyone who helped the Gallos found themselves frozen out of every racket in town. It was economic warfare, old world style. Still, Joe's health was starting to fail. Decades of stress, heavy food, and sleepless nights were catching up. He began coughing often, and his voice had grown weaker. But even as his body declined, his mind stayed sharp. He'd built his life on control, and he wasn't about to watch it slip away to a pack of loud young upstarts. Behind closed doors, Joe's most trusted advisor, Magliocco, urged him to end it peacefully. "They're like children, Joe," he said. "Let them play. Give them a small piece. Keep them close." Joe shook his head slowly. "You can't feed wolves and expect them to guard the sheep." While Joe tried to outthink them, Joey Gallo tried to outshine him. He began cultivating a public image, posing with artists and intellectuals, frequenting nightclubs, even giving quotes to journalists who found his rebellion romantic. To the press, he became a sort of Robin Hood figure, young, bold, unpredictable. The people loved him. But under the glamour, the money was drying up. The war had cost the Gallos their stability, and Joe knew it. Late one night, Joey's car was ambushed near Red Hook. He survived, barely, but 2 of his men didn't. It wasn't an open declaration, but everyone knew who was behind it. The Profaci retaliation had begun, not loud, not chaotic, but precise. It was chess, not checkers. As the months dragged on, the streets of Brooklyn became an invisible battlefield. Men who had once shared tables now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Trust was dead, loyalty had a price tag, and every whisper carried a threat. Joe Profaci continued to run his operations quietly from his Long Island home, appearing in public less and less. But even as his presence faded, his shadow stretched far. He was still the Don, still the man who could freeze your life with a phone call. In private moments, he prayed more than ever. His rosary became a constant companion. Those close to him said they often heard him mutter under his breath, "Forgive them, Lord, for what they've become." But there was a sadness in his voice, perhaps even guilt. For all his faith, Joe knew he had built a world where forgiveness had no place. By late 1961, both sides were exhausted. The streets were quieter, but it was the silence of burnout, not peace. Everyone was waiting to see who would fall first, the young rebels or the aging king. And then, one winter night, Joe Profaci collapsed at home. His family rushed him to the hospital, and though he survived the scare, the diagnosis was grim: cancer. The Don who had built an empire from olive oil and old country discipline was now fighting a battle even he couldn't control. Word spread quickly. The Gallo crew celebrated in whispers. They thought fate had done their job for them. But Joe wasn't finished yet. Even weakened, even sick, he remained the puppet master behind every move. He knew his time was running out, and he intended to use what was left of it to leave his empire in the hands of someone who could protect it. The war had taken its toll, but it wasn't over. Joe's final moves were coming, and like every good chess player, he knew the endgame mattered more than anything before it. By the spring of 1962, Joe Profaci had grown frail. The once proud Don, who'd commanded respect with a single word, now spent most of his days in a large armchair near the window of his Long Island home, staring out at his garden, the same garden where so many of his empire's decisions had been made. The olive trees he'd planted years ago stood tall and healthy, a living reminder of his rise from humble beginnings. But Joe himself was fading. His doctors had confirmed what he already knew. The cancer was spreading. The treatments did little except make him weaker. Still, he refused to show fear, even to his family. When his wife Nina wept quietly beside him, Joe took her hand and said softly, "A king doesn't fear the dark, my love. He just prays the dawn comes for his sons." But deep down, Joe knew the dawn wasn't coming for his family. Not the way things were going. The streets were slipping out of his control. The Gallo crew still held grudges, and even among his own loyal men, whispers of succession were growing louder. The man Joe trusted most was his old friend and underboss, Joe Magliocco. Loyal to the core, steady, a man who understood the old ways. To Joe, Magliocco wasn't just an ally, he was family. He wanted him to take over when the time came. But there was a problem. The young generation didn't respect Magliocco. To them, he was another relic of the past, a quiet old man playing a game that had moved beyond him. The streets wanted change, and change rarely came without blood. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Joe called Magliocco to his side. "When I go," he said, his voice weak but steady, "you take what's mine. You hold it together. Promise me that." Magliocco's eyes glistened. "I will, Joe. I swear it." Joe nodded slowly. "And the gallows?" Magliocco hesitated. "They're waiting, Joe, like wolves outside the gate." Joe smiled faintly. "Then we make sure the gate holds." That night, Joe summoned his last reserves of strength to meet with his captains. They gathered quietly in his home, their voices low, their eyes watchful. Some were loyal, others were already dreaming of their own rise. Joe saw through them all. He began to speak slowly, carefully. This family was built on faith, loyalty, and order. I've kept it clean when others drowned in greed. Remember that when I'm gone. Don't let chaos take root. There was silence. Then he said something no one expected. Forgive the gallows. Bring them back when I'm gone. A divided house cannot stand. The room shifted. Some of the men exchanged uneasy glances. Forgive the gallows? After everything they'd done? But Joe's face was calm, his tone final. They are part of this blood, whether we like it or not. We are not savages. We are builders. Don't let the world turn us into something we're not. That was the last meeting he ever called. Over the next months, Joe's strength faded further. The empire he had ruled for decades began to splinter quietly. Without his firm hand, rival crews started testing boundaries, expanding territories, taking liberties they never would have dared under his watch. The city could smell weakness, and in the underworld, weakness was the scent of opportunity. Meanwhile, the Gallo crew, sensing the shift, began reaching out through intermediaries. Joey Gallo, ever the strategist, knew Joe's death would open doors. He didn't want to fight the dying king. He wanted to claim the throne the moment it was empty. But Joe wasn't ready to give him that chance. In one of his final acts, he quietly arranged for key territories, particularly those tied to the olive oil business and the family's financial backbone, to be placed under Magliocco's legal control. It was a subtle but powerful move. The empire's wealth wouldn't fall into chaos. It would be protected. The last time Joe went to church, he was too weak to stand through the service. The priest helped him sit in a pew near the back. He prayed for peace, for forgiveness, and for the strength to let go. But there was something else in his prayer too, something unspoken. Perhaps a final plea that his legacy, so carefully built, wouldn't be destroyed by the greed of men who'd never understand the patience it took to create it. Days later, Joe Profaci passed away quietly in his sleep. No fanfare, no violence, no final words. Just silence. The news spread fast. For the first time in decades, Brooklyn's underworld stood still. Old-timers lowered their heads, remembering a man who had ruled not through fear but through discipline. To them, he was the last of a kind, a don who built his kingdom on business, not bullets. But while the city mourned, the vultures began to circle. The Profaci family was leaderless now, and though Magliocco stepped into the role as Joe had wished, the streets weren't ready to accept him. The gallows saw an opening. Within days, quiet meetings turned into tense confrontations. The fragile truce Joe had tried to leave behind began to crumble. The peace he'd prayed for dissolved almost instantly. It was as if the moment Joe's eyes closed, the order he had spent a lifetime creating vanished into the wind. At his funeral, hundreds came to pay their respects. Politicians, businessmen, priests, all men who owed something to the olive oil king. But behind their bowed heads and murmured prayers, everyone was thinking the same thing. Who's next? As the casket was lowered into the ground, a cold breeze swept across the cemetery. Magliocco stood at the edge, hands clasped, eyes red. He whispered, "I'll keep it together, Joe, I promise." But in the distance, watching quietly from a black car, Joey Gallo lit a cigarette and smiled, because he knew what everyone else did. Promises mean nothing in a city built on power. And though Joe Profaci was gone, the war he'd tried to end was about to begin again. This time, without the man who had once kept the chaos at bay. The day after Joe Profaci was buried, Brooklyn felt different. The air seemed to hum with new energy, restless, dangerous, alive. For years, every man in that part of the city had moved under the shadow of one calm, steady voice. With that voice gone, every whisper now sounded like a challenge. Every handshake carried the scent of betrayal. Joe Magliocco stepped into the role of boss quietly, just as Profaci had planned. He'd been the old Don's right hand for decades, loyal, discreet, disciplined. But while Joe had ruled with both faith and fire, Magliocco was a softer man. He didn't inspire fear, he inspired familiarity. And in the underworld, familiarity wasn't always an asset. His first order of business was to restore order. He met with captains, calmed the anxious, promised that nothing would change, but everyone knew it already had. The Gallo brothers were back in Brooklyn, smiling like wolves at a wounded herd. Joey Gallo wasted no time. He'd kept his crew small but loyal, and the streets were ripe for the taking. Where Profaci had been cautious, Joey was bold. He moved into abandoned territories, reopened old rackets, and whispered promises of better days to anyone willing to switch sides. Men who had once sworn allegiance to the Profaci name began quietly crossing over, tempted by the Gallo charisma and the hope of a fresh start under new leadership. Magliocco saw what was happening, but he wasn't Joe Profaci. He didn't have the same sharp instinct for control, and worse, he didn't have Joe's authority to back it up. The old Don had ruled like a father. Magliocco ruled like a caretaker. Still, he wasn't foolish. He knew he needed allies. That's when Joseph Colombo Dito came into the picture. Colombo was younger, ambitious, and clever in a way that made older men underestimate him. To Magliocco, he seemed reliable, a fresh face untainted by the Gallo War. He made him a captain, giving him more territory and responsibility than most men his age ever dreamed of. But in the back rooms of the city, people were already whispering, "Magliocco's too old for this world. The streets belong to Colombo and Gallo now." The war that Joe Profaci had fought so hard to contain was stirring again, only this time it was tangled in politics that went far beyond Brooklyn. In 1963, Magliocco and Joe Bonanno, another powerful boss, began meeting secretly. The two men felt cornered by the shifting tides within the Mafia Commission, the ruling council of families that dictated peace, power, and punishment across the country. Together, they hatched a desperate plan to eliminate the Commission's most powerful figures and seize control themselves. But what they didn't realize was that their conspiracy was already leaking through cracks in their own walls. Joseph Colombo, the man Magliocco had trusted completely, caught wind of the plan. And instead of keeping silent, he did the unthinkable. He went to the Commission and revealed everything. The room where Colombo made his confession has gone down in legend. A group of old, cold-eyed dons sat in silence while the young captain explained that his own boss had plotted against them. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he asked for permission to survive. The Commission believed him. Within days, Magliocco was summoned to answer for his betrayal. When he appeared, frail and nervous, they didn't order his execution. They were merciful, or maybe just practical. They fined him $50,000 and stripped him of power. And in that moment, the Profaci family, the dynasty Joe had built from nothing, was finished. The Commission looked to Joseph Colombo, the whistleblower, and saw an opportunity. He was young, he was loyal, and most importantly, he was clean in the public eye. They named him the new boss. Almost overnight, the Profaci name vanished from the underworld, replaced by something new: the Colombo family. But not everyone accepted this quiet transition. Joey Gallo, who had spent the last few years watching the chaos unfold from the sidelines, was furious. To him, Colombo was just another old man's puppet, another suit pretending to be a king. Gallo refused to bow to the new order. As Colombo consolidated power, Gallo began rebuilding his crew, reaching out to his old allies, promising one last fight for the streets he'd once ruled. The family may have changed its name, he told his men, but the blood that runs through it is still mine to spill. Brooklyn once again trembled with anticipation. The war wasn't over. It had just evolved. Meanwhile, Joe Magliocco returned home to Long Island, a broken man. He had betrayed the legacy of his closest friend, tried to cheat the very system Joe Profaci had always respected, and lost everything. Within a year, he fell ill, the same illness that had taken Joe, and passed away quietly. At his funeral, few came. The world had moved on. But as his coffin was lowered, one old friend murmured, "He tried to keep it together, Joe. He just wasn't you." Back in Brooklyn, Colombo was now the boss of one of the most powerful families in New York. But the peace he built was fragile, the kind that trembles beneath every breath. Joey Gallo was still out there, waiting, plotting, patient as ever. And in the quiet corners of the city, old-timers sometimes spoke softly of Joe Profaci, the Don who had ruled with calm precision, who had built an empire of olive oil and loyalty, who had tried to keep his family whole in a world that worshipped chaos. They said his ghost still lingered over the streets of Brooklyn, watching as his legacy was twisted, renamed, and reborn in violence. The olive oil king was gone, but his shadow, and the lessons he left behind, still haunted every man who dared to call himself a boss. By the mid-1960s, Brooklyn had a new king, Joseph Colombo. His rise had been as smooth as it was surprising. He'd gone from loyal soldier to boss almost overnight, and the newspapers quickly took notice. For the first time in years, the underworld had a new name making waves, one that wasn't whispered but spoken out loud. Colombo didn't shy away from the spotlight. He stepped right into it. He began attending public events, shaking hands with community leaders, and presenting himself as a proud Italian-American businessman. To most Dons, that kind of attention was suicide, but Colombo believed visibility was protection. "If they see me as one of them," he once told a friend, "they won't see what I really am." But not everyone was fooled, especially not Joey Gallo, who was biding his time in prison. Joey had been locked up after the first Profaci war fizzled out, convicted on extortion charges. To many, it seemed like the end of the Gallo story. But prison had a strange effect on Joey. It didn't break him, it sharpened him. He read books, learned law, and mingled with political radicals. He wasn't just thinking about the streets anymore, he was thinking about legacy. He began to see himself not as a gangster, but as something more, a rebel against corrupt power. And in his mind, Joseph Colombo had become the symbol of everything wrong with the world he'd once admired. In 1971, Joey walked out of prison leaner, colder, and more dangerous than ever. The world outside had changed. Long hair, protests, the city humming with unrest. But Joey fit right in. He was chaos in a tailored suit. Colombo, now an established figure, had started the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a movement that publicly fought against the use of the word mafia in media and government. On the surface, it looked noble, a man defending his community from stereotypes. But everyone in the life knew what it really was, a smokescreen, a way to protect his business by hiding it behind patriotism. Joey Gallo found it laughable. A mob boss pretending to be a saint, he sneered. Maybe I'll send him flowers next Sunday. But behind the jokes, he was planning something bold. He started rebuilding his crew, meeting with old friends and new faces. Many of the younger guys in the streets, tired of Colombo's rigid structure and cautious politics, gravitated toward Gallo's charisma. He offered them what they craved: freedom, excitement, purpose. Before long, whispers started again in Brooklyn bars and back alleys. Crazy Joey's back. Colombo knew it too. At first, he tried to ignore it. He'd built something rare: peace. Business was good, the police heat was manageable, and the commission respected him. The last thing he wanted was another war. But peace doesn't last long when pride is at stake. The tension between the two men simmered quietly for months. Joey began showing up at restaurants Colombo's people frequented, just to make a point. He'd smile, order a drink, and say, "Tell your boss Joey says hi." Colombo saw it as provocation. Then, in a twist no one saw coming, Joey started mingling with black activists and celebrities. He'd appear at jazz clubs, social events, and fundraisers with civil rights leaders, earning him the nickname, the Italian Malcolm X. It wasn't just rebellion, it was theater. Joey knew how to command attention, and he was using that attention to needle Colombo where it hurt most: his image. By 1971, Colombo's Civil Rights League was preparing for its biggest rally yet, an event in Manhattan that would attract thousands. The press was all over it. For Colombo, it was a chance to cement himself as both a political figure and a legitimate voice for his people. For Joey, it was an opportunity. On the morning of the rally, the air buzzed with anticipation. Banners waved, cameras flashed, and Colombo, surrounded by guards, walked toward the stage with a confident smile. The crowd chanted his name. Then, just as he reached the microphone, a man stepped forward, raised a gun, and fired. The sound echoed through Columbus Circle like thunder. Colombo collapsed, chaos exploded, and before anyone could make sense of what had happened, the gunman was shot down by police. Colombo survived. Barely. But he never spoke again. The bullet left him paralyzed and silent for the rest of his life. And though no one could prove it, everyone had the same thought. Joey Gallo did this. The streets lit up with fear and speculation. Gallo denied it, of course. Me? I was at dinner, he told reporters with a grin. Can't a guy have a steak without getting blamed for everything? But no one believed him. Colombo's allies swore revenge. The fragile peace shattered overnight. Joey, ever the showman, didn't hide. He flaunted his freedom, eating at high-end restaurants, laughing with movie stars, telling anyone who'd listen that he was just a businessman wrongfully accused. He even had the audacity to attend one of Colombo's own fundraisers not long after the shooting. The city watched in fascination. To the public, he was a charming outlaw. To the underworld, he was a marked man. What Joey didn't know was that the same streets that once adored him were now plotting his end. The Colombo loyalists were patient. They didn't rush. They waited, just like Joe Profaci had all those years ago, for the perfect moment when Joey would finally let his guard down. That moment came one spring night in 1972. Joey Gallo was celebrating his 43rd birthday at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. He laughed, toasted, told stories about his prison days, surrounded by friends and family. It felt like old times, the glory days. And then the door opened. The men who walked in weren't there for dinner. The night at Umberto's Clam House was one of those New York evenings that felt electric, humming with laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint music of the streets. Joey Gallo, dressed sharp in a dark suit with his usual confident swagger, was celebrating his birthday surrounded by family and friends. To outsiders, he looked untouchable, cool, charming, and larger than life. But beneath that charm, even he must have felt something, that uneasy silence that comes before a storm. The restaurant was small, intimate, the kind of place where the scent of garlic butter and clam sauce hung in the air. Joey sat at a table near the front, joking with his wife Sina and his sister Carmela. His laughter was loud, infectious, echoing through the cramped space. He looked like a man who had outrun fate. But outside, fate was catching up. Across the street, a car idled quietly. Inside were men whose faces were hidden by the night, men who hadn't come to eat. They were there for one reason, to close a chapter that had started decades earlier, when Joe Profaci ruled Brooklyn and his family's blood spilled over power. Inside, Joey raised a glass. To new beginnings, he said, flashing that familiar grin. His wife smiled, though her eyes darted toward the window. She didn't know why, but something felt off. And then it happened. The door burst open. The sound of rapid footsteps filled the room. Before anyone could react, the sharp pops of gunfire cracked through the laughter. The plates shattered, people screamed, and in an instant, the night turned to chaos. Joey stumbled from his seat, clutching his side, confusion and fury flashing across his face. He tried to stand tall. He'd always faced danger head-on. But his legs gave way. He staggered toward the door, blood pooling beneath him, and collapsed on the pavement outside, under the glow of a neon sign that flickered like a dying star. By the time the sirens wailed down Mulberry Street, it was over. Joey Gallo was gone. The news spread like wildfire. "Crazy Joe gunned down in Little Italy," screamed the morning headlines. The same press that had once adored his charisma now dissected his fall like vultures. To some, he was a tragic hero, a rebel who'd challenged the system. To others, just another gangster who met his end the only way gangsters do. But in truth, Joey's death marked more than the end of a man. It symbolized the end of an era. The old world of Joe Profaci, with its quiet codes, family dinners, and strict hierarchies, had evolved into something darker, more unpredictable. The newer generation didn't live by loyalty. They lived by greed and chaos. The honor that men like Profaci pretended to have was buried with Joey that night. Back in Brooklyn, the Profaci family, now the Colombo family, carried on. But it was never the same. The FBI had grown stronger, surveillance tighter, and public outrage louder. The mob couldn't hide in the shadows anymore. The very idea of respect that men like Profaci had built their empires on was eroding, fast. Some of the old-timers whispered that the curse of Profaci never really lifted. He built an empire on promises, one said, and every man who touched it paid the price. Joseph Colombo, paralyzed and speechless, faded away in a hospital bed a few years later. The family he once led splintered, its members turning on each other, chasing scraps of power in a city that no longer feared them. The glory days of the Brooklyn Dons were dying, replaced by indictments, prison terms, and a new kind of warfare, one fought in courtrooms instead of alleys. Yet the memory of Joe Profaci lingered, in every whispered name, in every backroom deal, in the way the young recruits still spoke about the old bosses. They remembered how he'd built something from nothing, a structure so strong it had survived decades of betrayal, greed, and bloodshed. And in some way, Joey Gallo's death tied everything together: the loyalty, the rebellion, the price of power. He was the last echo of Profaci's world, a man who tried to challenge a system too old and too ruthless to bend. Years later, the small restaurant where he fell became a landmark of sorts. Tourists stopped by asking, "Is this where Crazy Joey died?" They'd take photos, order seafood, and leave without ever understanding what those walls had seen. Because beneath the romantic stories and Hollywood glamour, there was always something deeper, something tragic. Men like Joe Profaci and Joey Gallo didn't just build criminal empires, they built myths. Myths about loyalty, power, and destiny. And like all myths, they ended not in glory, but in silence. The city moved on. The lights of Mulberry Street still burned bright, and new faces took the old places. But sometimes, late at night, the older men sitting in cafes would lower their voices and say, "You remember the Profaci days, when Brooklyn had real kings?" They'd sip their espresso, stare into the dark, and remember a time when power wasn't bought with money but earned with fear and cunning. And though their world was gone, one truth remained unchanged. Every empire, no matter how strong, eventually falls. But Joe Profaci's story, and the chaos it birthed, never truly disappeared. It lived on in every story told, every name whispered, every legend passed down in the neon glow of New York's restless nights. In the years following Joey Gallo's bloody end, Brooklyn felt different. The old streets that once pulsed with the rhythm of Profaci's empire now carried a quiet tension. Men who'd once ruled from behind butcher counters and olive oil companies began looking over their shoulders. The air of control, the illusion that the mafia's hierarchy was unshakable, was gone. Joe Profaci's legacy lingered like the scent of cigar smoke that never quite fades. Even after his death, his way of doing things, the businessman Don, calm, polite, ruthless when necessary, remained the blueprint. Yet his successors couldn't hold it together. They lacked his patience, his charm, and above all his gift for balancing fear with faith. After Joe's passing, the family splintered. Joseph Magliocco, his brother-in-law, tried to keep the peace, but by then, the old guard was weary and the young ones were restless. The Gallo brothers' rebellion hadn't been entirely crushed. It had simply gone underground, waiting for the right moment to flare up again. Brooklyn became a chessboard, every move made in whispers, every handshake hiding a knife. The FBI watched all of it with growing fascination. To them, this wasn't just organized crime, it was organized chaos, and they were finally learning how to track it. Wiretaps, informants, hidden cameras. The invisible eyes of the law began creeping into every bar, bakery, and basement meeting spot. What had once been the safest profession in America, being a made man, was now one of the riskiest. Meanwhile, in Little Italy, old men still raised their glasses to Joe Profaci's memory. He was the last real boss, they'd say. He didn't make noise, he didn't seek attention, he just made money. And that was true. Profaci's strength had always been his invisibility. While others boasted, he blended in. His olive oil business gave him cover, his church donations gave him legitimacy, and his quiet nature made him seem harmless to the outside world. But to those who knew him best, Joe was anything but harmless. He was the kind of man who smiled while making decisions that could destroy families. He could be charming in one moment and cold as marble in the next. And that unpredictability, wrapped in silk and smiles, was what made him so dangerous. By the early 1960s, however, the world Joe Profaci had built was unraveling. The Appalachian Meeting of 1957 had exposed the mafia to the world, forcing federal agencies to take them seriously. The media began using the term Cosa Nostra, and newspapers ran headlines about the Italian syndicate. Suddenly, secrecy wasn't enough. The mob was now public, and that visibility was poison. Inside the Profaci family, paranoia grew. Magliocco, desperate to hold on to power, made a fatal mistake. He joined a plot with Joe Bonanno to assassinate several top mob bosses, hoping to reshape the Mafia Commission in their favor. But the plan leaked, and when the truth reached the commission, Magliocco was done. He was forced to step down, his health failing and his influence shattered. The old Profaci empire was then handed to a man few expected, Joseph Colombo, once a loyal soldier, now a boss in his own right. The family name changed, but the ghosts of Profaci still haunted it. Colombo tried something new. He blended crime with activism, forming the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a movement that protested media portrayals of Italians as gangsters. For a while, it worked. He was on TV, in the papers, shaking hands with politicians. But deep down, the other bosses hated it. To them, Colombo was drawing too much attention, turning the spotlight on a world that thrived in the dark. In a way, it was everything Joe Profaci had avoided. Profaci had ruled through quiet authority. Colombo ruled through public spectacle. And in the end, that difference proved deadly. At a rally in 1971, as Colombo spoke before thousands of supporters in Manhattan, a man approached him and fired. The crowd screamed. Colombo collapsed on stage, paralyzed but alive. It was an act that stunned the city and marked another turning point for the family that had once been Profaci's. From that moment, the Colombo family spiraled into decades of infighting, betrayals, and federal cases. What Joe Profaci had built through discipline and discretion became a battlefield soaked in ego and ambition. Still, old-timers who'd lived through the golden days of Brooklyn's underworld never forgot where it started. To them, Joe Profaci wasn't just another boss. He was the architect of a system that, for a time, seemed invincible. He had shown that you could build an empire from pasta sauce and oil shipments, that you could sit in the front pew on Sunday and still control the city's black market by Monday. But no matter how strong the foundation, time always wins. By the late 70s, most of Profaci's original crew were either gone or retired. The streets had changed. Heroin had replaced bootlegging, young dealers replaced the old capos, and respect had given way to greed. The old codes were breaking down. And yet, somewhere deep in Brooklyn, in small pizzerias and quiet social clubs, the old names still carried weight. Joe Profaci's story became something like legend, a reminder of when crime had rules and bosses were gentlemen, at least on the surface. Dominic Montilio, decades later, would say in an interview, "Those were men who built empires out of nothing. You could hate what they did, but you couldn't deny what they were. Builders, visionaries of a world that shouldn't have existed but somehow did." It was the perfect description of Joe Profaci's legacy, the quiet king of an invisible kingdom, whose empire outlived even the men who tore it apart. By the time the 1980s rolled around, New York had transformed. The glitz of disco, Wall Street money, and neon lights hid the fact that the old city, the one ruled by the dons of Brooklyn and Manhattan, was slipping into memory. Yet, even as the world moved faster, Joe Profaci's shadow lingered, stretching quietly over the men who followed him. The Colombo family, once his proud creation, had become a storm of betrayal and blood. After Joseph Colombo's shooting, the family fell into chaos. Carmine Persico, a cunning and ambitious capo who'd grown up under the Profaci era, slowly took control. They called him the Snake, and for good reason. Persico had a way of surviving every turn, every hit, every betrayal. He was from the old school, raised on Profaci's quiet lessons: never trust too easily, always stay polite, and never show your fear. But the world had changed. The FBI had learned its game. They weren't just kicking down doors anymore. They were listening, recording, tracking every whispered word. Wiretaps filled the walls of cafes and social clubs. Agents began learning Italian slang, decoding the gestures and coded language that once made the mob untouchable. The underworld that Joe Profaci helped shape was now being dissected piece by piece. Still, among those who remembered him, there was a strange sort of respect for the man who started it all. He wasn't like the flamboyant gangsters of later years. He never drew headlines, never sought attention. When he spoke, it was softly, and people listened. He wasn't feared in the traditional sense. He was respected. That was rarer and far more powerful. In the archives of law enforcement, old FBI memos from the 1950s and 60s still mentioned his name. Joseph Profaci, believed to be the most stable and financially secure of the New York crime bosses, one report read. Even the agents chasing him had to admit Profaci didn't make mistakes, but even he couldn't stop what came next. The mafia wars of the 1980s, driven by greed, drugs, and betrayal, tore apart the remnants of Profaci's once disciplined world. The Colombo family became a revolving door of leadership, with factions turning on each other in brutal power struggles. What Joe had built with patience and diplomacy was now being destroyed by impulsive men who didn't understand that real power wasn't about who had the gun, but who controlled the silence. Yet, ironically, his methods lived on, not just in the mob, but in business, politics, and the quiet manipulations of city life. His philosophy, control through calm, profit through patience, loyalty through fear masked as respect, became a kind of blueprint for anyone who understood that true influence is invisible. In the mid-1990s, as New York cracked down on organized crime through the RICO Act, the FBI dismantled the Colombo family's operations one by one. Trials, testimonies, betrayals. It was the end of the old era. But still, when agents spoke off the record, they admitted that no one had ever run a family as smoothly as Joe Profaci. He had died in 1962 of natural causes, quietly in his Long Island mansion, something almost unheard of in the life he lived. No bullets, no betrayals, just the slow decline of a man who'd outsmarted fate. His funeral drew hundreds, not only from the underworld, but from the local church, the businessmen he'd helped and the priests he'd donated to. They called him Don Pepino, a name spoken with both reverence and fear. Even decades later, his legend persisted in whispers. Old soldiers from Brooklyn would say, if Profaci was still around, things wouldn't have fallen apart. He was remembered as the last Don who believed in rules, even in a business built on breaking them. There was an old story told among the men who'd served under him. One night, long before he became